Dr. Kelly Goldberg is a clinical assistant professor of anthropology at the University of South Carolina, working within the context of the transatlantic African diaspora. She is a historic archaeologist and the director of the university's Public Heritage Lab, which focuses on connecting K through 12 schools with archaeological resources. She was the recipient of a Fulbright Award, which supported her dissertation research on archaeological investigations of the transatlantic slave trade in 19th century Guinea. She has worked closely with the National Park Service and the South Carolina State Parks, looking at sites of historical erasure in the eastern US. And with that, I turn today's program over to Dr. Goldberg.
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you, Rachel, so much for that introduction. And thank you all for the chance to share some of our research updates with you. Sorry, just a quick technical thing. I'm getting an error that I can't share my screen while another participant is sharing. All right. Okay. I have troubles doing things while talking at the same time. One more try. I am so sorry. It's starting from the end of the PowerPoint. One more attempt here. Okay, I am so sorry about that. Even with practice, the technology gets us sometimes. Anyways, just thank you all again for coming, and I'm looking forward to talking with you a little bit about the recent research we've done in collaboration with state parks. Before I get started, I do want to give a quick shout out. I was so excited to see Jess Busa join. She is a celebrity guest and is featured here as one of our students who participated in some of the educational opportunities we'll talk about today. So this is part of a collaboration that has focused specifically on archaeological research at Sesquicentennial State Park. And so before I get into that, I want to just kind of see where we are baseline with the audience. If you could take a second and just enter into the chat, what do you think of, or what do you know about what archaeology is? What keywords jump into mind when you think about what archaeological research looks like? I see dirt, artifacts, history, uncovering the past. Great. So those are all accurate things. Digging, relics, artifacts. Oh, GPR, somebody knows about our methods. Touching the past, yes. Having that tangible connection is honestly what brought me into archaeology in the first place. It's a long story, but I was a history major, and archaeology is just so much more exciting because you get to touch it. All right. And so archaeology is an exploration of the past through those things that we're able to find by doing those subsurface the prospects of survey, or mostly the subsurface investigations. And so just to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page here, I did want to take a second to do a really brief kind of archaeology crash course here, so you're familiar with the terms that I'll talk about when we get to the work on Sesqui. So most of the images, just so you're aware, that I'm using here are from our excavations at Sesqui over the years. But archaeology is just in general the study of human history and prehistory through the excavations of sites and the analysis of artifacts and the other physical remains that we find. And so what that means, to break it down a little bit, is for archaeology, we are specifically interested in looking at the places where people used to live, activity spaces where people might have worked, but the emphasis here is on the used to end of that. Sometimes by coincidence, we do end up working on spaces where there are people still living and occupying those spaces when we've had space that's been reused over time. But in many cases, we are looking at spaces that have essentially been abandoned. And that's important to think about when you're contextualizing what the research results you hope to achieve are and what you expect to find. And so I love this image, when thinking about when somebody moves or leaves a place, they take all their best stuff with them, right? They don't typically, if they're intentionally moving or intentionally evacuating or, transferring to another area, they don't leave their best stuff behind. And so what we find is typically going to be either things that weren't effective anymore, things that may have been broken, things that people didn't mean to leave behind that accidentally fell. And so even when we don't have people who left, when we're looking at the overall use of a space, we think about that and where we're finding the artifacts. Was this something that was dropped by someone else? They were farming. Was this an object that was thrown away because it was no longer beneficial? And so I do kind of want to dispel the myth that, we're not going to pull out an entire intact ceramic vessel with, notes written on it and secret clues. We do have some exceptions to that. And so if you're familiar with some of those really noteworthy sites like Pompeii, or cases where we have natural disasters and people don't have time to get their goods, or we have cases where things are intentionally buried. We haven't found anything that's been intentionally deposited at Sesqui, but if you think about, grave goods, or if someone is, has, not to use it a trope, but has treasure or something that they want to come back to, that they might be storing in the ground. Some of those cases will find those larger intact objects. But for the context of what we're doing at Sesquicentennial State Park, the artifacts that we expect to find are the remains of items that are either made, altered, or adjusted, or used by people. And again, for our cases, these are things that are typically either thrown away or accidentally or intentionally discarded. And then we'll also talk about features today, and features are going to be immovable objects, things that humans made or altered that they can't physically move to a different space. And so the examples of features would be things like a post hole, right? If you're going to have a fence at your property, you dig a hole that you're going to bury the post for that fence in. Well, the fence itself might have decomposed. We can find evidence of that hole that was dug. We can't move it. We can't take that hole into a museum. So that's what a feature is. But when we think about artifacts, so here are a couple examples of complete objects. People use ceramic bowls and plates in the kitchen for food storage. We have different tools we use for hunting. These are not the complete things we find. So what we find tend to look more like the broken sherds of vessels that we used to use, or different components of tools that all of it might not have withstood the test of time, but the parts that haven't decomposed is what we're looking at here. And so by analyzing the artifacts and the features that we find at different sites, we can learn about the people that lived at those spaces. We can learn what they ate. So some of the things we find archaeologically, we might find animal bones. The image on the left here that you see, this is some cattle bones, and you can actually see evidence of humans having cut these bones or broken them in certain ways in the kitchen. The middle image shows some shells, and then the image on the right shows burnt seeds or burnt nuts that people consumed. And so we can take the archaeological artifacts that we find here of those food sources and actually figure out what they would have been in their whole or unaltered state. We can also figure out where people lived. And so here are some archaeological examples. The image on the left is the standing chimneys that were chimney ruins. That's actually from Cumberland Island in Georgia. And the rest of the cabins have fallen into disrepair or been salvaged for other parts. But you can see the archaeological remains here. The image on the top right is from a kind of the external structure of a teepee residence. And then the image on the bottom right is the foundation of a larger house. So these are examples of some of those features, right? Things that we can't necessarily pick up and move to a lab or pick up and move to a museum, but by analyzing these features, we can figure out what were those structures that people were living in at these spaces before they were destroyed. We can also figure out, well, what were people buying? What kinds of activities were they engaging in? And this is really exciting for us because this is what looking at these artifacts and interpreting how they were used or how they were selected for by people is one of those things that really kind of gives that more humanistic component to past populations, right? It's really easy to kind of detach ourselves when we're in a scientific mode and do our statistical analyses and, look at these objects that we're finding, but sometimes we forget about that human element. And so if we think about, how these pieces of ceramic plates or doll parts, actually, what were those objects that people were purchasing? Why were they selecting them? When we think about those ceramic sherds we find, right? We find lots of these broken pieces of vessels. And let me just jump back here for a second. So these are bowl sherds that were found at Sesqui. The image on the left is what we call a transfer print, and we can look at that artifact to figure out when was it made. There's different patterns that are produced at certain time periods or in certain locations. And so we can figure out that, people chose to buy imported goods that came from Europe into the United States. And then we can ask questions about, well, why might they have buying them? Obviously, people need to eat, right? They need plates. But why did they choose this design? Did someone like the aesthetics of it? Was it more affordable? Was it more regionally accessible? And so we can start to think about what were local economics that were going on. The image on the right is from a porcelain doll. We found quite a few porcelain doll fragments at Sesqui. So that tells us, well, now we know there's children at the site, right? We know that there are things purchased not just for function, but for play, for entertainment. And so again, that gives us the access to think about what people's daily lives actually were like at the areas we're investigating. Archaeology is not and has nothing to do with dinosaurs, despite a lot of disappointment from many school groups we've had come by at Sesqui while we're digging. And so joking aside, it is important. A lot of people do have some misconceptions about the intent of archaeological research, and we typically aren't looking for fossil data, especially fossils of animal species, in our research. So when we engage archaeological research, there's a few different steps that we follow. The first step we typically do is survey. And the reason we do this survey is this is going to be a non-invasive process. So when here, this is an example of, at another research project I worked on, we're doing metal detection. We weren't necessarily digging up the hits that we got, but you can see in the colors of the flag, we were flagging where there were ferrous or iron-based objects and where there were metal objects of other materials. And when we do survey, this can help us map out things like if we think, for example, we might be at a house site and we find a line of lots of iron hits. Well, sometimes it's possible those might be a row of nails from where a structure was, or they can help us figure out if there was some barbed wire attached to fencing around property. So this can help us. Survey can really help us to determine what might the boundaries of our site have been before we try to just do excavations on a larger scale. In addition to things like metal detecting, so somebody in the chat had mentioned GPR, right? GPR stands for ground penetrating radar. That's another way that we can see what's in the ground without disturbing that ground. One of the mantras of archaeology is you can only dig a site once, right? And so once you've done those excavations, you can't undo it. So we want to obtain as much information as possible before we actually do any in-ground research, again, just to make sure we preserve what we can. We also do just general pedestrian survey. So sometimes we'll have people walk at regular intervals across a surface or a landscape to see if we can identify where different features might be that, again, are going to kind of give us some clues as to where we might want to focus our excavations. Then once we start those excavations, typically at most sites, the first step is small scale, what we call shovel test pits or a shovel test survey. These are units we dig that are literally the size and width of a shovel. So you can see here, this is at another state park in South Carolina at the Red Cliff Plantation. And students here were learning how to do these shovel tests, and you have this small square hole that gives us a bit of a sample of what's in the ground. Sometimes we do shovel test pits just to see what the layers of soil are, so we can see if the area was disturbed. A lot of places where we've had reuse over time, and there may have been additional construction, well, if there's been, bulldozing or areas that have been dug up and then refilled in, that's going to destroy the archaeology there. And so doing a shovel test is a much more efficient way of getting that quick little peek into, is this area going to be an effective area to actually do archaeological research for? We can also look at the artifacts that we find when we do those shovel tests and figure out how those artifacts are distributed across a space. So if our goals are, we're trying to find out where a house was at a particular site, well, if we can look at where are we getting the most nails, the most ceramics, the most objects related to that structure, that's going to, again, help us zero in on where we want to focus our larger efforts. And then when we do those larger excavations, again, now we have that information that we've gathered from the survey, from those smaller excavations. We can do what we call units. And so a lot of what we do at Sesqui is based on, when we open a unit, it's typically 1 meter by 1 meter wide. Sometimes we'll do larger ones, a few abutting each other. Some locations, depending on the site, may have what we call excavation blocks. So we'll have large expanses of space that are open at one time. And again, this is just different ways to access the data. And then once our excavations are complete, we do artifact analysis. And so this is going to be actually the majority of the time that we spend on any given project. And so our analysis, there's kind of an estimate whenever people are planning projects. A lot of archaeologists will say for every 1 day you spend in the field, you spend at least 3 days worth of time in the lab to wash your artifacts, to sort them, to analyze them, weigh them, describe them, catalog them. And then even the next step is actually working on writing your presentations, articles that you publish, ways to disseminate that information to the public. So now I'm going to pivot, now that you have that general background, and talk specifically about the archaeology that we've done at Sesquicentennial State Park. These are all photos from our most recent field school this past summer of 2024. And so I'll talk in a second about where we dug, but in general, we've dug at several different locations throughout Sesquicentennial State Park that were all informed by historic maps, and gave us information about where we think people may have been living in the past. And so here you can see some examples of some of those different stages. In the middle, we have a student, Ella, who was doing some of that mapping and that survey prior to our excavations. On the left, we have Wyatt and Alexis, who are working on screening for one of those smaller scale shovel tests. And then on the right, we have Spencer and Caroline, who are doing a larger scale excavation block. So we've been the University of South Carolina has been collaborating with South Carolina State Parks for several years now on this project. And so we've helped take on part of State Parks' mission in general. And their mission as an entity is to encourage people to discover their South Carolina State Parks by providing resource-based recreational and educational opportunities that emphasize the conservation, protection, and interpretations of the state's natural and cultural resources. And so our work has focused on helping Sesqui to augment that cultural resource component. Sesqui is one of 47 existing parks throughout the state, and there are additional parks that are being established that are currently in the planning stages. Of those parks, Sesqui is one of 16 that were built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the early 1900s. And so we've been engaging these collaborative parts. The state parks has been engaging collaborative partnerships, and we are one of those partners, bringing in students and other community entities that have helped to work on this research. And then the next stage is we'll also continue working with state parks as we help to bring that research into the interpretive stage of parks efforts. So these collaborations actually started in 2019 with a University of South Carolina public history class. It was led by Dr. Robert Wyneth. And in this class, it was a graduate student class, and these graduate students did documentary and archival research looking at the history of Sesquicentennial State Park. And so their scope actually spanned a little bit longer term, kind of longer period than ours. They looked at the land's history prior to when it was a park, and then during that park history as well. And their research was incredibly important in helping us determine where the archaeological sites are most likely located. Some of what they turned up is historic maps that actually indicate a series of different occupational histories over time at this landscape. So you can see here just a few of those maps that we've been using. And I'll go into those in a little more detail in a second. So Sesquicentennial State Park specifically, as I mentioned, it's one of 16 parks that was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was part of a New Deal era initiative, and it was established to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the founding of Columbia. So the commission for the park was made in 1936. The land was acquired in 1937, and then the park was finally, construction was completed and it was open to the public in 1940. I do want to note that, we don't really have time to talk about it as part of today's presentation. When that park, when Sesqui was opened in 1940, it was opened as a segregated park. So it was made available to white residents of Columbia only. And it wasn't until much later that the park was desegregated and open and available to all residents. There is some interpretive material about that desegregation of the park at Sesqui. So they do have a wayside exhibit. Actually, if I pop back for a second, so it's not this one, but you can see an example here of in that top left image of a wayside exhibit. So there is an exhibit near from this vantage point, actually, you see in this photo, near the lake, that talks about that history of the civil rights, political fighting that had to go on to actually desegregate and make the park an equitable space open to all. And so today, we do still see remnants of some of those CCC constructions, not just remnants, but they're actually used today and reused. So the lake was augmented and kind of was built up with a dam that was constructed or also expanded upon by the CCC construction workers. There's picnic shelters that they built, a bathhouse that's used for to hold boats, picnic areas, and access roads. So all of these features were made available through that CCC land development. Here you can see, again, some of those features that were constructed in the 1930s and then included when the park was opened in 1940. So prior to the CCC's involvement in the space, there were several occupational zones throughout what is now the park today. The first known property owner of the park was James Douglas, who owned the property from 1842 to 1878. The map you see here on the right is a plat that was made for a property transfer to confirm the land area. And so this plat in 1880 shows where existing structures were at the time of the plat or the map's design. And so based on looking at that map, we know that there was a sawmill, there was a grist mill, there were crops that were grown at the park, and you can see that the red outline that you see overlaid on that map is the boundary of what is Sesquicentennial State Park today. Based on that, the research that was done by the South Carolina State Parks historian Al Hester and that 2019 class from USC, we know that during the time that he owned that property, James Douglas enslaved between 11 to 18 individuals. Again, those numbers vary based on different documentary sources, but we do know that among those individuals were included men, women, and children who were enslaved and worked on that property. In 1870, after emancipation, according to census records, we know that there were several domestic servants who lived on the property, as well as one resident who still worked there as an ox driver. And then in 1873, that mill that was still standing burned down. And this, I just wanted to zoom in a little bit on that map. And so it is kind of blurry because, again, what we're seeing is the digital version of this paper copy map that was produced in 1880. But just to draw your attention, in the center of the screen here, what you can see is we've taken this map and we've overlaid it on top of a modern view of the landscape of Sesqui. And so where they drew in this circular drawn lake, you can see where the pond is today. But more importantly, or from an archaeological standpoint, what I want to draw your attention to is to the left of the lake here, you can see these series of small dots right near, and I think See, I think you should be able to see now with my laser pointer here. So again, we've got the lake in the center. These small dots right here, you can see are what we believe were houses, potentially enslaved cabins that were constructed prior to 1880. We can't say that for sure, but we do know they were standing in 1880, and they were nearby areas that were used as areas where crops were grown. And this kind of black smudge right here, when we do zoom in on our map, we believe that actually says houses. And so we think that's a label for these structures that were here. That again, were definitively used as tenant farming houses post 1880, and could have been used for housing before then as well. We also have on this 1880 plat several structures over south of the lake, and then a few structures potentially east of the lake as well. And so we'll talk about those when we get to the archaeology excavation component. So after the Douglas family owned the property, the next owners were the Dent family. And so the Dents owned this property, the same area of Sesquicentennial, from 1886 through 1937. During this time, we know that a lot of the property was used for turpentine production. We've found, so at Sesquicentennial State Park, there are trees that have actual scarring still on them from when they were harvested for sap that was used in that turpentine industry. We also know there were other lumber operations on the property during this time. We know that areas of the property were rented out by tenant farmers, probably who were both growing other crops as well as harvesting, working on that turpentine industry. Based on looking at a series of different maps, we've identified 12 separate structures that were built and used on the property during that time. Those structures included a church and potentially a school that were located on the property near a cemetery that's still standing and used by descendant communities today. So based on that historical research and the maps that we identified, these led our driving archaeology research questions. And so our primary questions investigated or sought to investigate, whether or not we could determine if there is archaeology evidence remaining of those historic images. And so the reason we ask, does that still exist is, as I mentioned, a lot of this park has been redeveloped over time. And so even though these spaces were occupied prior to the CCC's construction, some of the construction they engaged in was fairly large scale. And so there is the potential that some of the archaeological remnants may have been destroyed or disturbed during that construction. You can see here in the map on the right are 3 separate field schools that we've conducted in collaboration with state parks since 2022. So all of those dots in the bottom image bring my pointer back. These dots in the bottom of this map, those little squares, those show some of those shovel tests that we did in that 2022 field school, looking to see if we could outline those larger square structures that were present on this map. In 2023, we switched areas and we focused on up here where these potential houses were. And then this past summer in 2024, we moved to some of these smaller structures that we think may have been associated with mill construction as well in the later period. That area in 2024, later maps, we see more structures built in that area as well. And so kind of breaking our question down a little bit further, again, step number 1 is, can we prove that there are actually archaeology remnants that are worth exploring? Our first field school, well, all of the field schools really have shown that yes, right? We've been able to identify or uncover artifacts. We've identified features that are associated with structures. And so we believe there's archaeological integrity to that. So then we can move on to our next question. Okay, well, now that we know there's archaeology remains, can we actually identify any specific features that are associated with either the Douglas or the Dents family ownership? Can we determine the age of the deposits that we're figuring out? Can we isolate those and figure out, are these structures associated with the earlier or later occupation? We can also ask questions about, well, how are these buildings used? Are we finding domestic things like ceramic fragments, like those toys or other things that people would be using in their daily lives? Are we finding more agricultural components, things that are associated with animal husbandry or with the growing and cultivation of crops? Are we finding industrial things? Are we finding evidence of that mill building or turpentine? So we can look at these different, or try to identify different activity areas and see if we can correlate the artifacts that we're uncovering with some of those spaces to figure out how people were using different areas of the property. And then finally, we can also see, well, can we actually confirm how long any of these given buildings were occupied? When were they built? Were they being consistently reused over time? Or were people moving to different spaces for different reasons? And then again, try to see if we can isolate those different components. So as we've been doing this work, we've engaged several different community collaboration strategies. And so before we could actually start this work, we had to redefine or think about, for this project, defining who are the stakeholders. And by stakeholders, we mean who has an investment in the research and in the work that we're conducting here. Our primary obligations, we feel, are to local descendant community members. So who are people that actually have descendant or ancestral ties to the land that was occupied? Who can say that they were related to, or potentially related or connected to, people that lived and worked in these spaces? And then who are the people that are just generally invested in these parks? Who uses these spaces today? Who is engaged in park activities? We have our educational communities then. So both the USC Field School students make up some of our collaborators. And then not just the students, but who is that more general educational community that's interested in this information as we obtain it. And then we also brought in as a collaborator, and I'll talk about in a second, the South Carolina Department of Education. So how we were thinking about, well, how can we on a larger scale share this research and disseminate the results such that they can be impactful to people beyond just the local regional Columbia area. And so I want to break down and talk about kind of what these collaborations look like on a variety of scales. And as I mentioned, we've done 3 years of summer field schools now at Sesqui in 2022, 23, and 24 of varying lengths. These field schools primarily focused on both doing that research. So how could we uncover data about the park, but also doing so in a way that included training for students, University of South Carolina students who enrolled in those courses. So we included training in what we call phase 1 and phase 2 excavation. And those are, just as I explained, the difference would be phase 1 is that more small scale shovel testing. So as you can see, Davis is doing in the bottom left image there. And then phase 2 is going to be that larger scale unit and sometimes block excavation, as you can see in that top right image, where students are looking at those larger 1 by 1 meter and 1 by 2 meter units. One of the things that we prioritized when we constructed our field schools is we made them intentionally low cost in order to maximize inclusivity to students. There's ongoing work trying to just make field schools more accessible to student researchers. There's various obstacles that students face, including high costs of field schools. Often field schools are people have to travel to, and so there are lodging costs or travel costs. And so one of the things that we were really excited about this project of Sesqui is being able to offer a local field school that students who are living and working in the Columbia area don't have to actually pay for travel costs to get to. And also, because it was working with the state park, we didn't have to pay for any other access or other materials. We were able to use state parks and the University of South Carolina supplies to do so. The field schools have also been helping us to build some annual continuity at the University of South Carolina, which is South Carolina's flagship university. And so as an R1 or a research institution, it's really important to us that we have ongoing research opportunities that students can engage in as they build their own academic course trajectories. And so we're able to create these continued regular field schools, again, that students can continue, and they can plan on that, knowing they'll have those opportunities to engage in those experiential, kind of tangible learning components. And then finally, these field schools enabled us to develop this really more robust partnership with the South Carolina Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Department and the university. And so now we've been able to, beyond just the field schools, we have ongoing projects that continue this research all throughout the year. And it's it's really great for us as an academic perspective to have state parks as a resource for our students to continue to connect with. And so for one example, one of our field school students who participated in this summer's field school is now working as a student intern doing research with the South Carolina State Parks on some of the artifacts we've uncovered from Sesquicentennial all throughout the year. And so it's been great having that kind of reciprocal relationship where we do work that benefits parks, and then they in turn serve as a valuable resource for our educational opportunities. And so I just want to show some of our artifact kind of summary findings. We've been able to start to answer some of those questions that I posed in our archaeology research design. So we found a lot of artifacts that relate to those structures. This top image on the top left here, these are some just kind of a hodgepodge survey of some of the nails that we found across the property. One of the really cool things about nails is we see a shift in nail typology over time. So the form of nails changes as our technology changes in terms of our construction abilities. And so what you see here in the most of those nails in the bottom, let's see, right here in the bottom half of this image, if you notice those nails with those nice square edges, those form a general category of what we refer to as cut nails. Cut nails are an older type of nail. They're made before we have the technology to make those what we call wire nails, or those nice round nails that you're familiar with today. And so we can actually look at where we find a higher concentration of cut nails versus where we're finding a higher concentration of wire nails to figure out where were the earlier versus the later occupations of the sites. We've also found a lot of things related to agricultural activities. And so here, our second image here, we believe this is related. This is part of a bridle piece related to potentially some horse hardware. We find things from clothing. So this third image here, we have part of the leather piece of a shoe. We find a lot of grommets. And then we find things from kind of daily use activities. So this image all the way on the right here, this is a fragment of an iron spoon. This is one of my favorite artifacts to show actually when we do children's activities or activities open to the public, because looking at objects that are similar but slightly different from things we use today are really cool ways to connect with children. And so showing this fragment of a spoon that by form looks almost identical to spoons we use today, but is made of different materials. And so we can tell that this is an older version. The bottom right here, you see a lot of the different types of glass we've been uncovering from the excavations at Sesquicentennial. We can do, and so as I mentioned, that student who is doing ongoing analysis, we can look at different types of glass to figure out what different functions were. So whether we have, sometimes the color of glass can give us information about what types of things were stored in it. There's different colors. So dark green glass, for instance, if we have like that dark olive green color, those are often bottles that historically held alcohol or other liquids. If we have sometimes like clear square glass bottles were more likely associated with medicinal things. Amber glass bottles have different purposes. So we can look at the color, the shape of the bottle, and different kind of manufacturing techniques that can tell us when they were made, where they were made, and what their functions were. We also have various shotgun shells and other objects related to kind of arms categories that enable us to look at, well, were people hunting on the site? Were they, what different functions was that serving? And then we find a lot of bricks and other architectural materials. So the artifact analysis is still ongoing. By the end of this year, we hope to have a final artifact catalog and summary that we can look at, kind of the statistics and further breakdown of what these different artifact classes are that we've been finding. Beyond just the actual archaeology field school courses, we've also had a few additional service learning courses opportunities that have come about through this partnership. As I mentioned, in 2019, we had that course led by Dr. Bob Wyneth, that graduate course that actually looked at the park history. And then in 2023, I taught an undergraduate course in the South Carolina Honors College, where it was an experiential learning course that built on both that 2019 grad school report as well as the earlier field schools that we had done. And so in the spring of 2023, undergraduate students actually, they worked with those archaeological materials to focus on creating interpretive materials that could be used in public outreach and engagement activities. In this course, I have a a little snapshot on the right of a story map that they made that is currently available. And actually, I'll share the link to this one too at the end. And the story map talks about the history of Sesquicentennial State Park, and they integrate some of the archaeological findings in that. And so that story map's been shared publicly to help share what that ongoing process looks like with members of the public who are interested in having that virtual experience. And this class was really, for me, it was great, another great opportunity to build on this partnership, because students were able to learn at this intersection of critical cultural heritage management and public education. So they got to see and think about and learn about the ways that we approach doing research. They were involved in looking at this collaborative approach and thinking about the different collaborative actors that we bring into this project. And then as part of their research process, they had to think about how to then pivot and share these materials on a larger public scale. And so these courses resulted in mutual benefits. So they created products that were helpful for the South Carolina state parks. And then on the flip side, we got that experience of students got to learn at live sites on the ground at these state park locations. Beyond the conclusion of these courses, there are also additional ongoing independent student research projects. As I mentioned, we have Thomas, who's working with Sesqui, looking at an overall general artifact catalog. Rachel Lanning is another current undergraduate student who's doing a senior thesis, specifically looking at one type of ceramic alkaline glazed stonewares that were produced, or that we found at Sesqui that we think are produced locally in Colombia. Beyond the archaeology field schools, we've had a variety of other USC departments that have collaborated as part of these efforts. And so SCIA, the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, provided some individuals who actually came and helped us do on-the-ground additional training. So we did some metal detection training, and then had students use that training to identify expansion of site areas. We also had expert lecturers who came and talked to the students about the production of historic and ceramic identification, metal conservation, and other different components that are engaged in archaeological research. Students were also able to work directly with the McKissick Museum. We had a tour of their facilities and their storage facilities, and the interim director was able to give students an idea of how the work they're doing in the field in archaeology actually ends up getting interpreted at the museum level. And this was really great because we were able to engage students in discussions on what those ethical policies are that are so critical when we in terms of that, curation and interpretation of objects. So we talked about not just taking the objects and putting them on display without context, but how to engage the various stakeholders and community descendants in having a voice in that interpretive experience. And then our final major collaborator is with a lab that I direct, the Public Heritage Lab. And so this lab our focus is trying to increase accessibility to archaeological resources. And so what we were able to do is we had our lab interns came out, and while we were doing those archaeology excavations, they were doing on-site photogrammetry training and data collection, which enabled us to produce virtual on both 3D, actual printed copies of artifacts, and virtual models of some of the objects and features we found at Sesqui so that they can be shared more widely with the public. And just as an aside, kind of a little plug here, this QR code will take you to the Public Heritage Lab's website. And we're using the students in the lab are using current materials excavated from Sesqui to try to connect with beyond just the the university academic level, but to try to connect with local K-12 students as well. And so in our lab, our students are working with K-12 educators to develop lesson plans, to try to create activities where students can use some of these more nuanced materials in their everyday active learning. Our varied product outcomes include, we're working on developing actual virtual museum spaces where members of the public can look at those objects and some of the features from the excavations. And then we're trying to actually have these student-led development of these K-12 lesson plans. Our lab has ongoing opportunities, so if anyone knows of students who are interested, we have paid and unpaid internships, more of these classes, and we're looking to expand our collaborations to additional partners. Another major collaborative partner as part of our research at Sesqui in the 2023 field school, we were fortunate to get a grant from the South Carolina Department of Education that supported us. We were able to host 8 K-12 educators. They spent a month on USC's campus, and then they actually got to come out and engage in the excavations with the undergraduate students. And the way we structured this, we had a bit of a lag. So that was our longest field season at Sesqui. We worked at Sesqui for 6 weeks, and we were able to have the undergraduate students start first. And so they had 3 weeks of more direct education and instruction. And then after 3 weeks, we had the K-12 educators join them. And so we had it set up such that the undergraduate students were in charge of teaching the K-12 educators how to do archaeology at that point. And we engaged this kind of multi-scalar modality. And one of the things that was really great about that was that the teachers did get to learn the methods of archaeology, but it also helped us build confidence in the undergraduate students as they were teaching what they had learned and kind of proving that they had the capabilities of teaching what they learned to others. That program, because of the length of it, so it was a full 8-hour-a-day, 4-week program, and we were able to furnish teachers with a training certification for the archaeology they learned. And then the primary deliverable for that project was they created between them 12 new lesson plans that focused on African American history in South Carolina. One of the major goals of that grant specifically was to create products that help to diversify source material in K-12 education. Despite updates that have been made to the South Carolina social studies standards, there still is an underrepresentation of African American diverse historical sites throughout the state. And so our hope was that in helping provide this additional source material and training to teachers, that we'd be able to start working towards increasing kind of more nuanced and more detailed lesson plans to expand that knowledge base among K-12 students. And so we have posted some of or I think all of the lesson plans are actually posted on the South Carolina Department of Education's website. We shared some of them as well through our Public Heritage Lab resources. If anyone is interested, we're happy to share these. These were created by the teacher participants, and so they do all meet specific South Carolina standards for particular grades. And then our final collaborative group, we've also been working with local descendants and interest groups. Each year that we've done an archaeology season out at Sesqui, we've hosted a public archaeology day. And so we've invited members of the public to come and actually see the ongoing excavations, participate to an extent. Just for safety reasons, we can't have members of the public doing the digging, but we've allowed people to help us screen. Typically for these public days, we put on kind of 2-word demonstrations. In this image on the bottom, you can see some local students who visited. We actually had they were able to help us kind of practice metal detecting. So they got to get experience in some of these various techniques that we do and participate in hands-on demonstrations. We've also been working on building connections with, as I mentioned at the beginning, descendants who actually have ancestral ties and family ties to the property. Brianna Kale has been the primary connection that we've worked through, and she's been the liaison to her larger family. One of the kind of things that really emphasized for me why it's so important to do even these small scale kind of virtual website dissemination projects is Bree actually found out about her family's connection to Sesqui when in that 2023 class, when we had been doing some research, some students had reached out to her. They found her on ancestry.com. She was doing family genealogy research, and they noticed that some of the census records she had found connected to the research we were doing. And so because of that, she was able to get involved in this project. And her family have been very excited about the research. And we've actually been able to, for the last couple of years, talk to the family members before we've done the archaeological research and get their input on what our research plans are to see. So we've been able to prioritize doing work that is kind of fits what the family's priorities are. And so for future work and kind of thinking about what this means going forward, I've got our swanky little 3D model there. You can take a look at just the image on the right here, that model. That is a castor wheel that was excavated at Sesquicentennial State Park, and that's an example of some of that 3D replica that our lab's doing to make these more digitally accessible. And so the archaeological research that we've done by augmenting it with these collaborative programs has really been a significant way for us to kind of expand our outreach and our community engagement. We're planning to continue working towards using archaeology as a baseline in these academic and educational sources. So we're hoping, even though that one-year teacher training program is finished, we've been actually continuing to connect with teachers who are in that program and then our extended networks to work on continuing to integrate these sources into those educational programs. And we're also trying to expand our dissemination of these virtual models and interpretive exhibits. And then finally, our Public Heritage Lab has been printing out, so some of these 3D models, we've been able to print them. We have an art student who paints them to make them look realistic. And then we're trying to get those incorporated into these lesson plans so teachers can have a physical, tangible object that students can be touching as they learn about these historical components. And then before I finish, I do just want to share some a bonus, a couple other upcoming events for other people who are interested in archaeology. October 8th, so next week from 4:30 to 6:30 p.m., we're hosting a volunteer archaeology lab night at the university. Members of the public are welcome to come and help us wash and sort artifacts that were excavated. We have some that were excavated at Sesqui this past summer, as well as some artifacts that were excavated from a local ongoing project we have at USC's campus. Anyone who's interested in more details can just use that email address at the bottom to sign up. We also have, at the end of the month on October 26th, is a statewide Archaeology of South Carolina, the Archaeology Society of South Carolina's Fall Field Day. And so it's a big family-friendly event where people are welcome to come and see. We'll be there with representations of some of the stuff we've produced in the Public Heritage Lab and the work we've done at Sesqui. And there are also many of other vendors. There's going to be some, I think, ongoing archaeology excavations. So it's a big fun event. And then throughout the entire spring, from January through April, we are going to be conducting excavation archaeology research on USC's historic horseshoe. So through another service learning course, we'll be doing our excavations on Wednesdays, and members of the public are always welcome to stop by and come and see that work. But we will also be hosting a couple specific open public days. So anyone who's interested, if you'd like to sign up for the Public Heritage Lab listserv at that email on the bottom, we'll be happy to share out those details. And so I want to thank just all of our contributors. We've had a lot of collaborators who have contributed to this project over the years. And then I would like to, I will stop and open it up to questions. I would welcome any comments or questions that anyone has about this research.
Well, yes, please, everybody who has some last minute questions, please do pop them into the chat. But first, thank you so much, Kelly, for sharing not only your passion and your expertise with your students, but also with everybody who was able to tune in today. Seeing that 3D model of that castor wheel was incredibly cool. This overall presentation was a wonderful overview about the field of archaeology and the outreach that's being done throughout the state. And my past experience as an archaeologist really revolved around descendant community engagement. So I'm so excited to get to hear about other other research projects that are being done. So thank you for sharing all of that and for sharing this rather large collection of resources for the public so that they can learn a little bit more about the field. So one of the first questions we got, if you have time, is can you explain or basically elaborate a little bit on how your thoughts are? Do privies constitute intentional or unintentional burrowing? Yeah, that word.
Burials? Yeah. That's a really great question, actually. I like that. I think both, I would say. So, but not in the same way we think of like artifacts being intentionally buried, right? So a privy, for anyone who's unfamiliar, a privy is an outhouse, a bathroom. And so privies, in a sense, they are an intentional burial of human waste to protect protect, local area, to have that concentrated for health reasons and other reasons. I don't know that I would consider them an intentional burial for artifacts necessarily. Usually intentional burials are going to have some kind of cultural component to them. And so we know people throw trash down privies, right? And so that's archaeologists. We love digging up privies. It sounds kind of gross, but we love to dig up because that's a great source of trash. But again, I don't know that I would call it like a culturally intended burial. But yeah, great question.
All right, thank you for that. And one additional question, how would you classify new sites being discovered? Like, how do you kind of pick out where you want to discuss and conduct an investigation?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. So we kind of have to think about motivations for, what are the research motivations, right? When we worked with the Sesquicentennial State Park, we chose to do research at that site because the park had expressed a need. They said, we know there was a cultural history here that hasn't been interpreted to the past or to the public, and they wanted to help make those stories more accessible. So they kind of sought out the research, and they said that they want to make it clear to people that this park isn't just a recreational facility, but that people used to live here and people used to work here, and share those cultural resources. Sometimes, though, when we choose to work at a place, it's more of a protection or preservation element. So luckily at Sesqui, because it's a park, we're not really as concerned with protecting archaeology resources because we know there's not a lot of planned construction there. But if there's an area where we know there's a new building going up in the city, we might do archaeology research there to try to help preserve whatever the historical remains are of a site that existed before it gets destroyed by that future work. So again, it depends on the reason, but those are both ways that we would help pick out or choose sites.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of cultural resource management, but it's always been the retrieval of artifacts, but not necessarily the preservation. So that's absolutely wonderful to hear. At this time, we are no longer able to accept any more questions. So we will be concluding our program for today. Here at Historic Columbia, we are very happy to provide programs like this Knowledge at Noon series for no charge, but we are appreciative of any monetary donations that you can make through our website at any time. There is a link in the chat, or we have the QR code up on the screen. Please stay tuned to our events page on our website, as well as subscribe to our newsletter or subscribe to any of the links that Dr. Goldberg was able to share today to just get some more information, including information about upcoming segments in this series, such as the presentation topics and the speakers for our next installment. You will receive a post-event email later today with a recording of this program, and this presentation will be accessible to be viewed on our YouTube channel as of later today. You can also catch some old episodes in this series on that YouTube channel as well. We will not be hosting a Knowledge at Noon for the month of November, but we will be picking the program back up in December. So please stay tuned to that events page to get a little bit more information about that upcoming program and that speaker. So we do want to say one final thank you to Kelly for giving this wonderful presentation. And we all want to thank you all for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.